A duke dressed as a common driver, his own wife in the back of his carriage, unaware of who truly held the reins. What she confessed during that ride would shatter everything he thought he knew about their marriage. But the truth, waiting at the end of that journey? No one could have predicted it. But before we continue, check if you are already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching this video from. The autumn rain of 1803 fell steadily on the cobblestones of London as Duke Edward Ashford adjusted the worn leather cap he had borrowed from his head coachman Thomas. His hands, accustomed to signing land deeds and parliamentary documents, trembled slightly as they gripped the reins of the modest hackney carriage. At 42 years of age, Edward had never imagined he would find himself in such a position, disguised as a common driver, waiting to transport his own wife to an unknown destination. The Duke of Ashford was one of the wealthiest peers in England. His estate stretched across 3 counties. His townhouse in Mayfair was the envy of society, and his political influence extended to the highest circles of power. Yet on this dreary afternoon, sitting atop a hired carriage in a simple wool coat, he felt utterly powerless. Everything had changed a fortnight ago when he discovered a letter tucked beneath a book in his wife's private sitting room. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the words carefully chosen but unmistakably intimate. "I shall await you at the usual place this Thursday at 3 o'clock. Your presence brings light to my darkest hours." There was no signature, only the impression of a seal he did not recognize pressed into red wax. Catherine, his wife of 18 years, had been the perfect duchess. She managed their household with grace, hosted dinners that were the talk of the season, and raised their 2 children with devotion. She was beautiful, educated, and moved through society with an elegance that made other women envious. Edward had always considered himself fortunate to have won her hand, even if theirs had been an arranged marriage typical of their class. But now doubt consumed him. The letter had awakened questions that had been lurking in the shadows of his mind for months. Catherine's unexplained absences, her increasing tendency to take the carriage out alone, the way she would abruptly end conversations when he entered a room. Small things, easily dismissed individually, but together they formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. Hiring a private investigator would have been the obvious solution, but Edward quickly realized the danger. In their social circle, discretion was impossible. Any investigator making inquiries would be noticed, talked about, speculated upon. The scandal would spread through the drawing rooms of Mayfair before he even learned the truth. His family name, his political career, his children's futures, all would be tarnished by mere suspicion. It was Thomas, his coachman of 20 years, who had suggested the mad scheme. "Your Grace," Thomas had said with characteristic straightforwardness, "if you truly wish to know where Her Grace goes without alerting anyone, you must follow her yourself. Dressed as I am, you would be invisible. No one notices the driver." The idea had seemed preposterous at first. A duke driving a hackney carriage through London. It violated every rule of propriety and social order. Yet the more Edward considered it, the more sense it made. Catherine would never suspect that the driver of a hired carriage was her own husband. He could hear her conversations, observe her destination, and discover the truth without risking exposure. Thomas had spent 3 days teaching Edward the basics of managing a carriage in London traffic. It was humbling. Edward, who prided himself on his excellent horsemanship, discovered that navigating crowded streets while managing temperamental horses and avoiding pedestrians required skills he had never developed. His hands blistered from gripping unfamiliar reins. His back ached from sitting in positions his body was unaccustomed to maintaining. "You must learn to become invisible, Your Grace," Thomas had instructed. "Keep your head down, speak only when necessary, and remember that to the quality we drivers might as well be furniture. They say things around us they would never say in company." Edward practiced disguising his voice, making it rougher, dropping the refined accent that marked him as a gentleman. He studied the mannerisms of working men, their posture, their way of moving through the world without drawing attention. It was an education in how the other half of society lived and moved unseen through the same streets he walked, as a peer of the realm. Now, on his 3rd day of surveillance, Edward waited near the modiste shop where Catherine often went. He had positioned himself strategically, close enough to see her emerge but not so close as to seem suspicious. The rain provided excellent cover. Drivers huddled in their coats, hats pulled low, indistinguishable from one another. When Catherine finally appeared, Edward's heart began to race. She wore a deep blue traveling dress and carried a small bag. But what struck him most was her expression. She looked nervous, constantly glancing around as if afraid of being observed. This was not the confident Duchess he knew. This was a woman with secrets. She walked directly toward his carriage. Edward's hands tightened on the reins. This was the moment. Either his plan would work, or his entire charade would collapse in humiliating exposure. "Driver," Catherine called up to him, her voice clear despite the rain. "Are you available for hire?" "Yes, madam," Edward replied, keeping his voice gruff and his face turned partially away. "Where to?" Catherine gave an address Edward did not recognize. It was in Clerkenwell, a respectable but decidedly middle-class neighborhood, nowhere his wife should have business. She climbed into the carriage without looking at his face, as Thomas had predicted she would. Edward clicked his tongue and the horses moved forward, carrying him and his wife into the unknown. The rain continued to fall, creating a curtain of privacy around them. Through the small window that allowed the driver to communicate with passengers, Edward could hear Catherine settling herself on the seat. His mind raced with possibilities. Clerkenwell was known for its craftsmen, its small businesses, its modest but respectable residents. Why would a duchess venture there alone? The obvious answer, the one that had driven him to this desperate measure, was an assignation. Perhaps a lover who could not come to Mayfair, perhaps someone completely outside their social sphere. The thought made Edward's chest tighten with pain. He had always believed that despite the arranged nature of their marriage, he and Catherine had developed genuine affection over the years. They had shared the joy of their children's births, weathered family crises together, built a life that seemed solid and real. Had it all been a performance on her part? The traffic was heavy, wagons loaded with goods, other carriages, pedestrians dodging between vehicles, all created a slow procession through the city. Edward navigated carefully, grateful for Thomas's training. The extended journey gave him time to observe Catherine through furtive glances in the small mirror Thomas had positioned for exactly this purpose. She sat very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Every few moments, she would reach up to adjust her hair or smooth her dress, nervous gestures Edward recognized from years of marriage. She looked out the window frequently, but seemed to see nothing, lost in her own thoughts. "Bit of weather we are having?" Edward ventured, testing whether she would engage in conversation. Many passengers ignored their drivers entirely, which would make his task more difficult. Catherine's eyes met his in the mirror briefly. "Yes, quite dreadful. Though I suppose the rain brings its own kind of cleansing." Edward felt a jolt. Even in those few words, he heard something in her voice he could not quite identify. Not happiness, not guilt, but something deeper. Resignation, perhaps. Or determination. "Been to Clerkenwell before, madam?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. There was a long pause. Edward wondered if he had overstepped, if she would retreat into the silence passengers often maintained with hired help. But then she spoke. "Yes, I go there regularly. It is becoming quite familiar to me." The admission struck Edward like a physical blow. Regularly. This was not a single indiscretion, but an established pattern. How long had this been happening? How had he been so blind? "Must be an important place, then," Edward pressed gently, trying to keep the conversation flowing without seeming too curious. Catherine sighed, a sound heavy with emotion. "Important? Yes. I suppose it is the most important place I visit. More important, in many ways, than anywhere I go in society." Edward's hands tightened on the reins so forcefully that one of the horses tossed its head in protest. He forced himself to relax his grip. What could possibly be more important than her duties as a duchess, her responsibilities to their family? "Your husband does not accompany you." The question came out before Edward could stop it. Too direct, too personal. He held his breath, fearing he had revealed himself, but Catherine did not seem offended by the familiarity. Instead, she laughed, a bitter sound that Edward had never heard from her before. "My husband? No, he knows nothing of this place or the people I see there. And if he did, I fear it would destroy everything." The words hit Edward with the force of a cannonball. Destroy everything. So she was aware of the damage her actions could cause. Yet she continued anyway. The betrayal felt fresh and sharp, as if happening in this very moment, rather than having been ongoing for who knew how long. "Perhaps he would understand more than you think," Edward said, his voice barely steady. "Perhaps if you gave him the chance to know the truth." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with unshed tears. "You do not understand. My husband is a good man, a great man in the eyes of the world, but he lives in a realm of perfection, of control, of maintaining appearances. There are parts of life, parts of reality, that simply do not exist in his world. And this, what I do, where I go, it is all firmly outside that world. Edward felt as if she were describing a stranger, not him. Was this truly how Catherine saw him? As someone so rigid, so concerned with appearances, that she could not share the truth of her life with him? All husbands have their limitations, he said carefully. But most would want to know if their wives were in some kind of trouble or distress. Most would want to help. Help? Catherine's voice rose slightly. My husband helps by writing checks to charitable institutions. He helps by serving on boards and attending benefit dinners. But getting his hands dirty with the real struggles of real people, that is beneath his notice. He has worked his entire life to rise above such things. Each word was a dagger. Edward wanted to stop the carriage, throw off his disguise, demand to know when he had become such a figure in his wife's mind, but he forced himself to remain silent, to let her continue. This painful honesty was what he had sought, even if hearing it was agonizing. They passed through increasingly modest neighborhoods. The grand houses of Mayfair gave way to smaller townhouses, then to simple brick buildings with shops on the ground floor and apartments above. The people on the streets changed too, no longer the well-dressed ladies and gentlemen of society, but working men in worn coats, women with market baskets, children playing in puddles without governesses to scold them. Edward saw his city as if for the first time. He had lived in London his entire life, but always within the golden circle of wealth and privilege. These streets, these people, they had been invisible to him, just as Thomas had said drivers were invisible to the quality. You care for these people, Edward said quietly, making it a statement rather than a question. I care for what is real, Catherine replied. In my world, everything is artifice. The conversations we have at dinner parties mean nothing. The clothes we wear cost more than most families earn in a year. We play at life while others actually live it. And you find that here? Real life? Edward asked, genuinely trying to understand. I find purpose here, Catherine said. I find people who need help that matters, not just another donation to build a wing on a hospital that will bear my husband's family name. I find honest emotions, honest struggles, honest gratitude. Edward navigated around a broken wagon, giving himself time to process her words. Was this about charity? But why the secrecy? Why the fear that he would be destroyed by knowledge of her good works? The people you visit, they are fortunate to have your attention, Edward said carefully. Catherine's response surprised him. No, I am fortunate to have theirs. They remind me of who I really am, beneath all the titles and expectations. They remind me that I was not always a duchess. Edward nearly dropped the reins. Not always a duchess? What did that mean? He knew Catherine's background, or thought he did. She had been the daughter of a country gentleman, not of the highest rank, but certainly respectable. She had come to London for the season at 18. They had been introduced at a ball and their families had arranged the match. It had all been proper and predictable. Or had it? For the first time, Edward realized how little he actually knew about Catherine's life before their marriage. He had never questioned her past, never asked about her childhood, her family, her experiences. He had accepted the version presented to him and moved forward with the business of building their life together. We are nearly there, Catherine said, peering out at the streets. The address I gave you, it should be just ahead on the left. Edward's heart pounded as he guided the horses toward the destination. Whatever truth awaited, he was about to witness it. The house Catherine indicated was modest, but well-maintained, a narrow brick building with window boxes that would have held flowers in a better season. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth inside despite the rain. Edward brought the carriage to a halt and climbed down to open the door for Catherine. He kept his head low, his face turned away, as any proper driver would do. Catherine gathered her skirts and stepped down, then reached into her reticule to pay the fare. "Keep the carriage here," she said, handing him more coins than the journey warranted. "I shall need you to wait and take me back in an hour." Edward touched his cap in acknowledgement, relief flooding through him. He would have time to observe, to understand what happened inside that house. Catherine walked to the door without hesitation, her knock answered almost immediately by a woman in a simple housemaid's dress. The door opened wider, and Edward's world tilted on its axis. The woman greeting Catherine was not a servant after all, but someone near Catherine's own age, with the same elegant bearing despite her plain clothing. And behind her, running forward with obvious joy, came a young girl of perhaps 12 years, calling out a name that made Edward's blood run cold. "Mother?" Edward stood frozen, unable to process what he had just witnessed. Mother. Catherine had 2 children, their son Robert, who was 16 and studying at Cambridge, and their daughter Margaret, who was 14 and currently at their country estate. There was no 12-year-old girl, there could not be. Yet the child threw herself into Catherine's arms with the ease of long familiarity, and Catherine embraced her with the same fierce love Edward had seen her show their own children countless times. The woman in the doorway smiled at this reunion, then ushered both Catherine and the girl inside, the door closing behind them. Edward's mind raced through possibilities. An illegitimate child. But when? Catherine had been under the watchful eye of society since their marriage, and before that. Before that, what did he really know? Had there been a scandal before they met, carefully hidden by her family? He thought back to their wedding, to the haste with which it had been arranged. Catherine's father had seemed almost desperate to see the match concluded. Edward had attributed it to financial considerations, the man eager to secure his daughter's future with a wealthy duke. But what if there had been another reason entirely? Edward tied the horses and found a position near the carriage, where he could observe the house while appearing to be doing nothing more than seeking shelter from the rain. Other drivers and workmen stood in doorways up and down the street, and he blended in among them, just another working man waiting out the weather. The hour Catherine had specified stretched out interminably. Edward's mind would not settle. A child calling Catherine mother. The implications were staggering. If this was Catherine's daughter from before their marriage, it meant she had given birth at perhaps 16 or 17 years old. It meant her entire entry into society, her presentation as an eligible young lady, her marriage to him, all of it had been built on carefully constructed lies. But if so, who was the father? And why had the child not been quietly adopted or sent away, as was the usual practice in such situations? Why had Catherine maintained this connection, visited regularly, clearly remained intimately involved in this girl's life? Edward watched the windows of the house, catching occasional glimpses of movement within. He saw shadows that might have been Catherine and the girl, and once, clearly silhouetted against the lamplight, the woman who had answered the door, embracing Catherine in a way that suggested deep familiarity and affection. An older man passing by nodded to Edward. "Waiting for your fare?" "Yes," Edward replied gruffly. "Lady inside visiting. Said an hour." The man chuckled. "Ah, the quality in their visits. Never as quick as they say, are they? That house there, see it regular. Sometimes a fine carriage, sometimes hired like yours. Same lady each time, though. Very proper, always pays well." Edward's interest sharpened. "You know who lives there?" "Widow woman and her daughter," the man said. "Respectable people. Quiet. The girl goes to the parish school, polite as anything. Mother does sewing work for some of the better shops. Been there 4-5 years now. 4 or 5 years. That would make the timeline align with when Catherine's unexplained absences had begun. Edward had attributed them to charitable work or social obligations, never questioning further. Why would he? He trusted his wife, or he had, until that letter had shattered his certainty. "They related to your lady?" the man asked, curious now. "Not my place to say," Edward replied, closing down the conversation. The man shrugged and moved on, but Edward's mind continued to race. If Catherine had secretly supported this household for 5 years, she had done so with extraordinary care. He thought about their finances, the allowance she received, the accounts she managed. Had she been diverting money all along? How much must it cost to maintain an entire separate household? The door opened, and Catherine emerged, the young girl clinging to her hand until the very last moment. Edward saw Catherine lean down, say something to the child that made her smile despite obvious tears, then gently disengage and walk toward the carriage. The girl watched from the doorway, the woman's hands on her shoulders, both of them waving as Catherine climbed back into the carriage. Edward secured the door and climbed back to his position, taking up the reins with hands that still trembled. He had come seeking confirmation of infidelity and found instead a mystery far more complex. "Back to Mayfair, madam?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Yes, please. The address where you collected me." Catherine's voice was thick with emotion, and when Edward glanced back through the small window, He saw her wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. They rode in silence for several minutes, Edward struggling with the urge to abandon his disguise and demand explanations. But something held him back. Catherine had been living with these secrets for years. If he revealed himself now, in anger and confusion, he might never understand the full truth. She would retreat behind defensive walls, and the opportunity for honest revelation would be lost. "She is a beautiful child," Edward said finally, taking a calculated risk. Catherine's head snapped up, her eyes meeting his in the mirror with sudden fear. "You saw her. Hard not to notice a young girl running to embrace you," Edward said carefully. "Forgive me, madam, but I could not help observing." Catherine was silent for a long moment, clearly debating how much to reveal to this stranger who had witnessed her secret. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "She is my daughter." The words hung in the air between them. Edward forced himself to breathe normally, to show no reaction beyond what a hired driver might feel at such a confidence. "I see," he said neutrally. "And your husband knows nothing," Catherine interrupted. "And if he ever learned the truth, it would end everything. Our marriage, my place in society, my children's futures, everything I have built would crumble." Edward's throat tightened. So this was it, the great secret. Catherine had a daughter from before their marriage, a daughter she had hidden from him for 18 years. But why? Other men of his class had dealt with such situations. True, it was scandalous, but if handled correctly, discreetly, it need not have been catastrophic. Unless there was more. Unless the father was someone unacceptable, someone whose identity would cause worse scandal than the illegitimate birth itself. "Forgive me, madam, but you burden yourself with this secret," Edward said, his voice gentle despite the turmoil inside him. "Surely there are those who could help, who could understand." Catherine laughed bitterly. "Understand? My husband is a duke. His family lineage is immaculate, his reputation beyond reproach. He married me believing I was a gentleman's daughter with an unblemished past. If he knew that I had borne a child out of wedlock before we met, that I have maintained a relationship with that child in secret all these years." She trailed off, shaking her head. "But the circumstances," Edward pressed, "surely they matter. How you came to have this child." "The circumstances would make it worse, not better," Catherine said firmly. Then, as if the words had been locked inside her too long and suddenly could not be contained, she continued. "I was not always Catherine Ashford, wife of a duke, mistress of great estates. I was once simply Kate Browning, daughter of a country clergyman who could barely feed his family." Edward nearly lost control of the horses. A clergyman? Not a country gentleman? The entire foundation of his understanding of his wife's background was crumbling. "My father served a small parish in Yorkshire," Catherine continued, her words now flowing as if a dam had burst. "We were poor, driver. Not genteel poverty, where one has to economize on new dresses. Real poverty, where we ate bread and thin soup because there was nothing else. My mother died when I was 14, leaving me to care for my younger siblings, while my father buried himself in his books and his prayers." Edward listened in stunned silence as Catherine described a childhood he had never imagined. She spoke of working her fingers raw doing washing for wealthier families, of going without food so her siblings could eat, of the constant fear that her father's modest living would be taken away and they would be left truly destitute. "When I was 16, a wealthy family came to our parish for the summer. They had a country house nearby and needed staff. I was hired as a maid." Catherine's voice dropped lower. "Their son was home from university. He was handsome, charming, and he paid attention to me in a way no one ever had. I was foolish and lonely and desperate to believe that someone from that world could truly care for someone like me." Edward felt a coldness spreading through his chest. He could already see where this story was leading. "By the time I realized I was with child, he had returned to London. When I wrote to him, his reply came not from him but from his father. There would be no acknowledgement, no support, no communication. I was a problem to be managed and dismissed." Catherine's voice hardened with the memory. "My father was horrified, not by my suffering but by the scandal. He sent me away to a distant cousin in Cornwall, a woman who took in young women in my situation. I gave birth there, alone, except for the cousin's grudging care. I was told I would give up the baby for adoption, that I would never see her again, that I would return home as if nothing had happened." "But you did not," Edward said quietly. "No," Catherine confirmed. "When I held my daughter for the first time, I knew I could never abandon her. The cousin agreed to keep her for a price. Every penny I could earn I sent to Cornwall. For 2 years I worked as a maid in great houses during the season, sending my wages to ensure my daughter was fed and clothed and not sent away. Edward was beginning to understand the extraordinary effort Catherine's deception had required. "How did you become Lady Catherine Ashford?" "Fortune," Catherine said, her voice filled with irony. "Or perhaps misfortune, depending on how one views it. I was working in a house in London during the season. The daughter of the family was unwell on the night of a major ball. I was near her size, and the mistress of the house needed someone to help alter a gown. She saw me in the dress and had an idea. She was a woman who loved intrigue and social games. She thought it would be amusing to present me as a distant cousin visiting from the country." Edward remembered that ball. It was where he had met Catherine. Or rather, where he had met the woman he had believed to be a gentleman's daughter named Catherine Browning, newly arrived in London society. "The lady who presented you, she knew your true background?" Edward asked. "She knew I was a maid, nothing more," Catherine said. "She thought she was playing a harmless prank, presenting a servant as quality and seeing if anyone noticed. What she did not know was that I was desperate. When I met your husband that night, I saw an opportunity for security, for a life where I could protect my daughter from poverty forever. So I lied. I played the role of a gentleman's daughter, and when the Duke of Ashford began to court me, I let everyone believe the fiction." Edward felt as if he were listening to the story of strangers, not his own marriage. "And the family that supposedly arranged your match?" "The lady who presented me was childless and bored. She enjoyed the drama of it all. When the Duke proposed, she and her husband agreed to pose as my guardians, to provide the proper papers and background. They fabricated the story of my father, the country gentleman. It was all a performance, and I played my part because the alternative was returning to Cornwall with nothing, losing my daughter to an orphanage or worse." The rain had stopped, but Edward barely noticed. His entire world was refracting through this new lens. Everything he thought he knew about his marriage, his wife, his life, had been built on carefully constructed lies. "Your daughter," Edward said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "The woman who lives with her now." "My cousin from Cornwall," Catherine explained. 5 years ago, when the woman passed away and her house was sold, I used my own money to bring my daughter to London, to set them up in Clerkenwell. I visit every week, sometimes twice. I pay for everything, her education, her clothing, her food. I use the allowance my husband gives me, the money from the household accounts, anywhere I can find funds without arousing suspicion." Edward thought of the generous allowance he had always provided Catherine, never questioning how she spent it. He thought of the small inconsistencies in the household accounts he had noticed over the years, but dismissed as trivial. All of it had been funding this secret life. "And the child, she knows you as her mother?" Edward asked. "Yes," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "She knows I cannot acknowledge her publicly, that I can never truly be her mother in the eyes of the world. But I refuse to let her grow up thinking she was abandoned, that she was not wanted. She deserves to know she is loved." Despite everything, Edward felt his heart twist at those words. Whatever deception Catherine had practiced, her devotion to her daughter was real and fierce. But it did not change the enormity of what she had done. "You have lived a lie for 18 years, Edward said, and this time he could not keep the emotion from his voice. "Every day of your marriage, you have lied to your husband." Catherine's response was sharp. "And what choice did I have? Tell me, driver, what would a great duke have done if I had revealed the truth before our wedding? Would he have married a former maid with an illegitimate child? Would he have accepted my daughter into his household, raised her alongside his legitimate children?" Edward wanted to shout that he would have, that he was not so rigid and unforgiving. But he knew with painful honesty that the younger version of himself, the man who had courted Catherine 18 years ago, would have been horrified. That young duke had cared deeply about bloodlines and proper connections. He would have ended the courtship immediately. Perhaps not then, Edward admitted, but in 18 years of marriage there must have been moments when you could have told the truth, when you could have trusted your husband with it. "Could I?" Catherine challenged. "My husband is a good man, but he lives in a world of absolutes. Right and wrong, proper and improper, suitable and unsuitable. Where in that world is there room for a woman who lied her way into his life, who has been deceiving him every day since?" Edward had no answer, because Catherine was right. He had lived in a world of absolutes. He prided himself on his integrity, his adherence to social norms, his impeccable reputation. How would he have reacted to learning such a fundamental deception? Even now, knowing the truth, He was not sure he could reconcile it with his sense of order and rightness. They were approaching Mayfair now, returning to the world of grand houses and carefully maintained appearances. The contrast between the modest streets of Clerkenwell and these elegant avenues was stark, a physical representation of the two lives Catherine had been living. "What will you do now?" Edward asked quietly. "Continue this double life indefinitely." "What else can I do?" Catherine replied, her voice weary. "I am trapped by my own deception. I cannot reveal the truth without destroying everything. My husband's reputation would be ruined, my children would be ostracized, my daughter would be exposed to scandal. So I continue as I have been, loving two families, belonging fully to neither." Edward brought the carriage to a halt near the modiste shop, where he had first collected Catherine. She remained seated for a moment, gathering herself before stepping back into her role as the Duchess of Ashford. "May I ask you something?" Edward said, turning slightly so he could see her better, while still keeping his face partially hidden. "Do you regret it? The deception, the marriage, all of it?" Catherine met his eyes in the mirror, and in her gaze, Edward saw deep sadness mixed with resignation. "I regret the necessity of it. I regret that I could not be honest. But the life it has given my daughter, the security, the education, the chance for a future. No, I cannot regret that. A mother does what she must for her child, regardless of the cost to herself." She paid him generously and stepped down from the carriage. Edward watched her walk away, her posture straightening, her expression smoothing into the serene mask of the Duchess. Within moments, she was greeting an acquaintance, chatting about some social event, completely transformed back into the woman society expected her to be. Edward sat in the carriage for a long time after she disappeared from view, his mind churning. He had set out to discover if his wife was betraying him with a lover. Instead, he had learned that she had been deceiving him since before they even married, that their entire marriage was built on lies, that she had a daughter he knew nothing about. But he had also learned of her desperate circumstances before their marriage, her love for her child, her sacrifice and constant worry to maintain both families. The situation was not black and white, not the simple betrayal he had feared. It was complex and painful and human, in ways that challenged everything he thought he believed about honor and truth. Edward returned the carriage to Thomas that evening, changing back into his proper clothes in a private room at his club. Thomas asked no questions, simply taking the carriage and nodding respectfully as Edward left. The discretion Edward had always valued in his servants now took on new meaning. They saw so much, these invisible people who served the quality, and they kept so many secrets. When Edward arrived home that night, Catherine was in the drawing room with their children. Robert was home briefly from Cambridge, and Margaret had returned from the country earlier than expected. They were laughing together over some story Robert was telling, and Catherine's face was alight with genuine joy. Edward stood in the doorway, unnoticed for a moment, watching this scene of domestic happiness. These were his children, raised with every advantage, knowing nothing but security and privilege. And somewhere across the city was another child, Catherine's daughter, who had none of those advantages despite being equally loved by the same mother. "Father," Margaret noticed him first, jumping up to embrace him. "You are home early." "I finished my business sooner than expected," Edward said, hugging his daughter. At 14, she was beginning to resemble Catherine, the same elegant bearing, the same intelligent eyes. Would she have looked even more similar to her half-sister? The thought was surreal. Catherine's eyes met his across the room, her expression carefully neutral. "Did you have a productive day, my dear?" The casual question, asked 1,000 times over the years of their marriage, now carried weight Edward had never felt before. "Did you have a productive day discovering all my secrets, all my lies?" "Quite productive," Edward replied evenly. "I learned several things I had not known before." Was that a flicker of fear in Catherine's eyes? But it passed so quickly he might have imagined it. She turned back to the children, asking Margaret about her riding lessons and Robert about his studies. Dinner was a pleasant affair on the surface. The conversation flowed easily, touching on politics, society news and family matters. But Edward could barely focus on the words. He watched Catherine, really watched her, perhaps for the first time in years. How had he never noticed the sadness beneath her smiles, the distance in her eyes even as she engaged warmly with their children? After dinner, when the children had retired to their rooms, Catherine prepared to go to her own chambers. Edward stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Catherine, could we speak privately in my study?" She froze. and he saw genuine fear flash across her face before she controlled it. "Of course. Is something wrong?" "Nothing wrong," Edward said carefully. "I simply have something I need to discuss with you." They walked together to Edward's study, a room lined with books and filled with the smell of leather and pipe tobacco. It was his sanctuary, where he conducted business and made decisions that affected hundreds of people across his estates. Tonight it would be the setting for the most important conversation of his life. Catherine sat in the chair across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight. She looked every inch the Duchess, composed and elegant, but Edward could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers gripped each other too tightly. Edward did not sit behind his desk. Instead, he pulled a chair close to hers, sitting so they were nearly at eye level. He took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything between them forever. "Catherine, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interruption." He paused, gathering his courage. "2 weeks ago I found a letter in your sitting room. It was from someone unknown to me arranging to meet you. I believed you were having an affair." Catherine's face went pale, but she remained silent, honoring his request not to interrupt. "I could not bear the uncertainty, yet I could not risk hiring an investigator who might spread gossip, so I conceived of a plan that seemed mad at the time. I borrowed a hackney carriage from Thomas and disguised myself as a driver. I waited for you near your usual shops, and 3 days ago I drove you to Clerkenwell." Recognition dawned in Catherine's eyes, followed by horror. Her hand flew to her mouth. "I drove you again today," Edward continued, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I heard everything you told me, believing I was a stranger. I know about your daughter. I know about your past. I know about the deception that has underlain our entire marriage." Catherine stood abruptly, turning away from him. Her shoulders shook, but she made no sound. Edward stood as well, giving her space but remaining close. "I need you to understand why I am telling you this," Edward said. "I could have confronted you with anger, with accusations. I could have demanded explanations while hiding behind my discovery, but that would make me a hypocrite. I deceived you to learn your secrets. The least I can do now is be honest about my own deception." Catherine turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "How long have you known?" "Since this afternoon," Edward said. "I heard everything in the carriage today. Your childhood, your circumstances, how you came to be presented in society, all of it." "And now what?" Catherine asked, her voice breaking. "Now that you know I'm not who you thought you married, that our entire marriage is built on lies. Will you cast me out? Divorce me? I understand if you must. I have been preparing for this possibility for 18 years. The resignation in her voice cut Edward deeply. She had been living with this fear every day of their marriage, waiting for the moment when everything would collapse. "Sit down, Catherine," Edward said gently. "Please." She did, slowly, as if her legs could barely support her. Edward sat as well, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. Truly looked, perhaps for the first time in their marriage. "I am angry," Edward admitted. "Angry that you lied to me, that you have been lying for 18 years. Angry that you did not trust me enough to tell me the truth at any point in our marriage. Angry at myself for being the kind of man who made you feel you could not be honest." Catherine wiped her eyes. "You have every right to your anger. What I did was wrong. I knew it was wrong even as I did it. But I was desperate, and once the lie was told, I could not see how to untell it without losing everything." "Your daughter," Edward said. "Tell me about her. Not the facts I overheard, but who she is." Catherine looked surprised by the question. "Her name is Elizabeth. She is 12 years old, bright and kind and so very brave. She loves to read like you do. She excels at her studies. She asks endless questions about the world." Catherine's voice softened with love. "She knows I am her mother, but she also knows I cannot publicly acknowledge her. She understands, or she tries to, but it breaks my heart every time I have to leave her, every time I cannot attend her school events or celebrate her accomplishments openly." "And the woman she lives with? Your cousin?" "Margaret. She is a good woman, patient and caring. She raised Elizabeth with love when I could not be there. Now she remains as her guardian, maintaining the fiction that Elizabeth is her daughter while I visit as a family friend." Catherine's expression was pained. "It is a terrible arrangement, born of impossible circumstances, but it was the best I could do." Edward processed this information, trying to reconcile it with everything he knew about his wife. "The money you have been using to support them, you have been very careful about concealing it." "I had to be," Catherine said. Every penny I could spare without raising questions went to them. Sometimes it was not enough. There were times when Elizabeth needed medicine or new clothes for school, and I had to find creative ways to acquire additional funds. I sold jewelry, claiming I had lost pieces. I economized on household expenses and kept the difference. I became an expert at deception. The admission hung between them. Edward thought of all the times he had praised Catherine's excellent household management, never realizing it was partly because she was skimming funds for another purpose. He should have felt more betrayed, but instead, he found himself thinking about the desperation that must have driven such careful, sustained deception. "Why did you never tell me?" Edward asked. "Not at the beginning, perhaps, but later, after years of marriage. Did you never think I might understand?" Catherine met his eyes directly. "Would you have, truly? You are a duke, Edward. Your family line is ancient and proud. You have spent your life upholding certain standards, certain expectations. How could I tell you that your duchess was born in poverty, worked as a maid, bore a child out of wedlock before you met her, that everything you believed about our match was a fiction?" Edward wanted to protest, to insist that he would have understood, that he was not so rigid and unforgiving, but he forced himself to be honest. "The man I was 18 years ago? No, I would not have understood. I would have been horrified. I would have felt deceived and betrayed, which I suppose I was, and I would have ended the marriage if legally possible." Catherine nodded, unsurprised. "And the man you are now?" Edward considered the question carefully. "I am still angry. I am still hurt by the deception, but I am also beginning to understand why you felt it was necessary, and I am ashamed that I was the kind of man who made such drastic deception seem like the only option." "It was not entirely about you," Catherine said. "It was about survival. I had a child to protect, to provide for. When I met you, when this opportunity presented itself, I took it because I was desperate. I convinced myself that the deception was justified, that I would be a good wife to you, that I would earn my place even if I had obtained it through lies." "And have you been?" Edward asked. "A good wife?" Catherine looked at him with surprise. "I have tried to be. I have managed your household, raised your children, fulfilled every duty expected of a duchess. I have been faithful to you in every way except honesty. But perhaps that is the most important faithfulness, and I have failed you there completely." Edward stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened gardens. "I have been giving much thought to the concept of truth today. You lied about your past, about your family, about your circumstances. Those are facts that could be proven false, but in another sense have you been living a lie. You have been an excellent mother to our children. You have been a devoted wife. You have managed social obligations with grace. Are those things false because they were built on a false foundation?" "I do not know," Catherine admitted. "I have asked myself that question countless times. Am I truly the Duchess of Ashford, or am I Kate Browning playing a role? After 18 years, I am no longer certain where the performance ends and the reality begins." Edward turned to face her. "Today, in the carriage, you spoke to me, thinking I was a stranger, with more honesty than you have ever shown your husband. You revealed your true thoughts about our marriage, about our life together, about who I am. That conversation was perhaps the most truthful interaction we have ever had." "And what did you think of what you heard?" Catherine asked quietly. "Of the picture I painted of you as a man who cannot see beyond his world of perfection and control." Edward returned to his chair, sitting heavily. "I think you were right. I have been so focused on maintaining appearances, on ensuring everything in our life meets certain standards, that I stopped seeing the reality beneath the surface. I stopped seeing you as a full person with your own past and struggles. I accepted the version you presented because it was comfortable and fit my expectations." "That was what I counted on," Catherine said softly. "I knew that if I performed the role well enough, you would never look deeper. And you never did, until something forced you to." "That letter," Edward said. "The one that started all this. Who was it from?" "Margaret," Catherine answered. "My cousin. She writes to arrange my visits, always carefully worded in case someone else sees the correspondence. The day you found it must have been when I left it in the wrong place." She gave a bitter laugh. "After 18 years of perfect caution, one careless moment nearly exposed everything. And if I had not found that letter, would you have continued indefinitely? Would you have taken this secret to your grave?" Catherine looked at him with sad certainty. "Yes, Because the alternative was losing everything. Losing you. Losing Robert and Margaret. Losing my place in this life. I could bear living a lie. I could not bear losing my children. Robert and Margaret are adults, or nearly so, Edward pointed out. They could understand, could accept. Could they? Catherine interrupted. Could our son, who will inherit your title and estates, accept that his mother was a housemaid who lied her way into society? Could our daughter, who will make her debut next year, bear the scandal of learning her mother bore an illegitimate child? They would be ostracized, their prospects ruined. I could not risk it. Edward knew she was right. The society they lived in was unforgiving of such revelations. Their children would suffer for Catherine's past, fair or not. But he also knew that secrets had a way of emerging, and the longer they were kept, the more destructive their revelation became. What about Elizabeth? Edward asked. What is her future in this arrangement? She grows older. She will want more than secret visits from a woman she cannot publicly call mother. Catherine's face crumpled. I know. That is the impossible part. I cannot give her what she deserves, what she needs. I can only give her what I can, and hope it is enough. It is not enough, Edward said, not cruelly but stating fact. You know it is not enough. Then what would you have me do? Catherine asked, her voice rising with desperation. Acknowledge her publicly and destroy everything. Cast her aside completely to maintain my deception. There are no good choices, Edward. There never have been. Edward stood and began to pace, his mind working through possibilities. There are no good choices, but perhaps there are better ones than what you have been doing. Living in constant fear, dividing yourself between two families, unable to fully be present for either. That cannot continue. What are you suggesting? Catherine asked warily. I am not certain yet, Edward admitted, but I know that we cannot go forward as we have been. This secret is poisonous, Catherine. It has infected our entire marriage. You have been unable to be honest with me, and I have been unable to truly know you. That is not a marriage, it is a performance. Then you want to end it, Catherine said flatly. I understand. I did not say that, Edward replied, but we must decide what we want this marriage to be. Do we want truth with all its complications and difficulties, or do we want the comfortable lie, knowing it will always stand between us? Catherine stood as well, moving toward him. Edward, if we pursue truth, if we try to bring Elizabeth into this family openly, the scandal will be enormous. Your reputation will suffer. Your political career will be damaged. Our children will face social consequences. Is truth worth that cost? It was the question Edward had been grappling with all day. Was truth worth the price it would demand? He thought of his carefully constructed life, his reputation, his standing in society. He thought of Robert and Margaret and the futures he had envisioned for them. All of it would be complicated, perhaps damaged, by revealing Catherine's secret. But he also thought of Elizabeth, a child growing up in the shadows, knowing her mother but unable to claim her. He thought of Catherine, living in constant fear and guilt. He thought of his own marriage, built on a foundation of deception that had prevented real intimacy or understanding. I do not know if truth is worth the cost, Edward said honestly, but I know that continuing to live a lie has its own cost, one we have been paying for 18 years. Perhaps it is time to consider a different path. What path? Catherine asked. There is no precedent for this. No acceptable way to introduce a hidden illegitimate child into a ducal family. No acceptable way according to society's rules, Edward agreed. But whose rules should govern our lives? The people who would judge us, who would ostracize our children for circumstances beyond their control. Should we continue to let fear of their judgment dictate how we live? Catherine looked at him with something like hope mixed with terror. You would truly consider this, acknowledging Elizabeth, bringing her into our family? I am considering it, Edward said carefully. I am not promising it. There are many complications to think through, many consequences to consider, but I am willing to explore the possibility. Catherine sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. I never imagined. I thought if you ever discovered the truth, you would cast me out immediately. I never dared hope you might react this way. I am not sure how I am reacting yet, Edward admitted. I am angry and hurt and confused, but I am also trying to understand. Today in the carriage, you spoke about the divide between the world of the quality and the real world where people struggle. You were right about that too. I have lived my entire life insulated from those struggles. never having to think about where my next meal would come from or how I would care for a child with no resources. He sat across from Catherine again, leaning forward. You did what you felt you had to do to survive, to protect your daughter. I cannot entirely fault you for that, even as I am hurt by the deception, but I can fault myself for being the kind of man you felt you could not be honest with. It was not entirely you, Catherine insisted. It was society, expectations, the way things are done in our world. Any man in your position would have reacted the same way to learning such truth. Perhaps, Edward allowed, but I do not have to continue being that man. I can choose to be different, to value truth and compassion over reputation and propriety. Catherine shook her head slowly. You make it sound simple, but it is not. You have duties, responsibilities. You are not just yourself. You are the Duke of Ashford. You carry your family name, your title. You cannot simply set those aside. Can I not? Edward challenged. What good is a title if it prevents me from living with integrity? What value is a reputation built on lies and secrets? But our children, Catherine said desperately. Think of Robert and Margaret. They have done nothing wrong. Why should they suffer for my mistakes? It was a fair question and one Edward had been wrestling with. We would need to tell them the truth carefully, help them understand. They may surprise us. Young people are sometimes more adaptable, more accepting than we give them credit for. Or they may be horrified and ashamed, Catherine countered. They may never forgive me for deceiving them their entire lives. That is possible, Edward acknowledged, but they also deserve the truth. They deserve to know who their mother really is, not just the performance she has given them. Catherine buried her face in her hands. This is too much. After years of keeping this secret contained, now everything is spilling out and I cannot control any of it. Edward moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands gently. Perhaps control is part of the problem. You have been trying to control the narrative, to manage every detail, to keep all these separate pieces from touching each other. But that kind of control requires constant vigilance and comes at great cost. Catherine looked down at their joined hands. I have been so afraid for so long. Fear has governed every decision I have made since before I met you. Fear of poverty, fear of losing Elizabeth, fear of exposure, fear of losing everything I built. I am exhausted by it. Then perhaps it is time to try something different, Edward said gently. I am not saying we must solve everything tonight, but we could begin with honesty between us. No more secrets, no more pretending. Just two people trying to figure out how to move forward together. You would do that? Catherine asked, searching his face. After everything I have done, all the lies I told, you would be willing to try to rebuild our marriage? I am willing to try, Edward said. I cannot promise where we will end up. I cannot promise I will not struggle with anger and hurt. But I am willing to try if you are willing to be truly honest with me from this point forward. Catherine pulled one hand free to touch his face, a gesture of tentative affection. I want to be honest. I am so tired of lying, even lies of omission, but I am terrified of what honesty will cost us. Then we face that cost together, Edward said, as partners, not as performers playing roles. They sat in silence for several moments, both processing the enormity of what they were considering. Finally, Catherine spoke again. There is something else you should know. About Elizabeth's father. Edward tensed. Go on. He was the son of Earl Worthington, James Worthington. Catherine's voice was steady now, as if a decision had been made to reveal everything. He died 6 years ago in a riding accident. He never knew what became of me or of Elizabeth. His family never knew about her existence. Edward knew the Worthington family. Earl Worthington had passed away 2 years prior, and the title had passed to James's younger brother. They were a powerful family with significant political influence. Does Elizabeth know who her father was? No, Catherine said. I saw no purpose in telling her. He wanted nothing to do with us when I informed him of the pregnancy. Why burden her with knowing her father rejected her before she was even born? But she has other family, Edward pointed out. The current Earl is her uncle. There are cousins, a grandmother who still lives. She has blood relatives who know nothing of her existence. And what good would it do to inform them? Catherine asked. They would deny any connection. It would only bring scandal and pain. Edward considered this. Or they might want to know her, they might want to help. They might want to silence an inconvenient reminder of their dead relatives' indiscretion, Catherine countered. People of our class do not welcome such complications. Edward stood and moved back to his own chair, his mind working through the implications. You are right that this is complicated beyond anything I initially imagined, but I want to meet her. Catherine's head snapped up. What? Elizabeth, your daughter. I want to meet her. Edward spoke firmly, having made the decision even as the words left his mouth. If we are going to move forward with honesty, I need to know this part of your life. I need to meet this child who has been so important to you. Edward, I do not think that is wise, Catherine said carefully. She knows nothing about you except that you are my husband, a great duke who would be horrified by her existence. If you appear suddenly, then we will explain the situation honestly, Edward interrupted. We will tell her that I recently learned about her, that I want to know her. Children are resilient, Catherine, and if she is anything like you describe, she is intelligent enough to understand complicated situations. Catherine shook her head, but Edward could see she was considering it. And what would you say to her? How would you explain why her mother's husband suddenly wants to meet her after 12 years of being unaware she existed? I would tell her the truth, Edward said simply, that I learned about her recently, that I understand her mother loves her very much, and that I want to know the people who are important to my wife. You would not tell her that our entire marriage is based on lies? Catherine asked fearfully. I would not burden a child with adult complications, Edward assured her, but I would be honest about what I can be honest about. No more deception, Catherine, not with her, not with our children, not with each other. Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark garden. When she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. You do not understand what you are asking. Elizabeth has built her life around the understanding that her mother can never publicly acknowledge her, that she must remain hidden. If you enter that picture, everything changes for her. Everything is already changing, Edward said. The question is whether we guide that change thoughtfully or let it happen chaotically if secrets eventually emerge another way. Catherine turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. I am so afraid of losing her. If this goes wrong, if somehow my worlds collide in the wrong way, I could lose both my families. Edward crossed to her, taking her shoulders gently. You could. I cannot promise that will not happen, but I can promise that I will try to prevent it. I will try to help us find a way forward that protects everyone, especially the children involved. Why? Catherine asked, searching his face. Why would you do this? I have lied to you for 18 years. I have deceived you in the most fundamental ways. Why would you help me now? Edward considered the question carefully before answering. Because, despite the deception, despite the lies, I believe the woman you have been to me, the mother you have been to our children, is real. The love and devotion I've seen are not performances, and because after hearing you speak honestly today in that carriage, I realize you have been trapped by circumstances and fear, not acting from malice. That does not excuse what I did, Catherine said. No, Edward agreed, but perhaps it explains it in ways that allow for moving forward rather than simply ending everything. Catherine wiped her eyes. If we do this, if you meet Elizabeth, you must understand that she is fragile despite her strength. She has built her entire identity around being the child her mother visits but cannot claim. You appearing in her life will shake that foundation. Then we will be careful, Edward said. We will go slowly. We will let her adjust to the idea before we make any decisions about what happens next. And our children? Catherine asked. Robert and Margaret, when do they learn about their half-sister? Not yet, Edward said firmly. First I meet Elizabeth, then we assess the situation together and decide how and when to tell Robert and Margaret. They deserve to know, but we need to be thoughtful about how we tell them. Catherine nodded slowly. When do you want to meet her? Tomorrow, Edward said. If that is possible. I do not want to wait and give myself time to reconsider. Catherine looked shocked. Tomorrow? That is very soon. The longer we wait, the more time there is for doubt and fear to change our minds, Edward pointed out. If we are going to do this, we should do it before practical concerns overwhelm our resolve. Catherine took a deep breath, clearly struggling with the decision. Finally, she nodded. Tomorrow, then. I usually visit on Thursday afternoons, but I can send word that I will come in the morning instead with someone I want Elizabeth to meet. Margaret will be surprised, but she will allow it. Then it is settled, Edward said. Tomorrow morning you will take me to meet your daughter. They stood facing each other in the study, the weight of the decision hanging between them. This was the point of no return. Once Edward met Elizabeth, once this secret was shared even partially, there would be no going back to the careful compartmentalization, Catherine had maintained for 18 years. That night, Edward lay awake in his bed, his mind refusing to settle. Across the hall in her own chambers, Catherine was likely equally sleepless. They had maintained separate bedrooms for years, a common practice among their class, but tonight the physical separation felt symbolic of the emotional distance that had characterized their marriage. Edward thought about the conversation in the carriage, Catherine's words about him living in a world of perfection and control. He thought about how accurate that assessment was. He had built his entire life around maintaining standards, meeting expectations, upholding the family name and reputation. But what had that control actually given him? A marriage based on deception, children who knew a carefully edited version of their mother, a life that looked perfect from the outside but was hollow at its core. He thought about Elizabeth, a child he had known nothing about until hours ago. What must her life be like, knowing her mother but unable to acknowledge the relationship publicly, growing up in modest circumstances while her mother lived in a mansion across the city, having half-siblings she could never meet? The unfairness of it struck him forcefully. But confronting that unfairness would require upending the careful social order that governed their world. It would mean facing scandal, gossip, judgment from peers. It would mean his children facing questions and possible ostracism. Was he truly prepared for those consequences? Edward rose from his bed and moved to the window, looking out at the dark streets of Mayfair. Somewhere across this city, Elizabeth was sleeping, unaware that her life was about to change. Did he have the right to disrupt her world? Or was maintaining the status quo, as painful as it was, the kinder choice? But then he remembered Catherine's face as she spoke about her daughter. The love and pain mingled together. He remembered her admission that she was exhausted by fear and deception. How many more years could she sustain this double life, and what would happen when she could not anymore? No, the status quo was not sustainable. Change was coming whether they chose it or not. The only question was whether they would guide that change or be destroyed by it. As dawn began to break over London, Edward finally made peace with his decision. He would meet Elizabeth today. He would begin the process of understanding this hidden part of his wife's life, and then they would decide together how to move forward. He dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were respectable, but not ostentatiously wealthy. If he was meeting a child who lived modestly, he did not want to overwhelm her with displays of aristocratic privilege. When he descended to breakfast, he found Catherine already there, looking as if she had slept as little as he had. "Are you certain about this?" she asked as he sat down. "No," Edward admitted, "but I am going forward anyway." They took Edward's personal carriage, driven by Thomas, who had been informed only that they were making a visit to friends in Clerkenwell. The trusted coachman asked no questions, though Edward suspected he had figured out more than he let on. As they travelled through the city, Catherine sat rigidly beside Edward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I should prepare you for what to expect," she said quietly. "The house is small, much smaller than anything you are accustomed to. Margaret and Elizabeth live simply. They have enough to be comfortable, but there are no luxuries." "I do not require luxuries," Edward said. "I am not going to judge your family by the size of their home." "You say that now," Catherine replied, "but you have lived your entire life surrounded by wealth and privilege. Seeing how most people actually live may be more shocking than you anticipate." Edward thought about his experience dressed as a carriage driver, seeing the city from a working person's perspective. "I have had some recent education in how the other half lives. I think I can manage." Catherine looked at him curiously but did not press the point. Instead, she continued with practical information. "Elizabeth knows me as Aunt Catherine, a family friend who helps support them financially. Margaret is her mother in public. Elizabeth knows the truth, but she has been taught to maintain the fiction when others are present." "That must be confusing for a child," Edward observed. "It is," Catherine agreed sadly, "but it is the best arrangement I could manage. At least she knows I am her mother, that I love her. That is more than many children in her situation have." They fell silent as the neighborhoods changed around them, the grand houses giving way to more modest dwellings. When they finally arrived at the familiar house with the flower boxes, Edward felt his heart begin to race. This was real now. There was no turning back. Margaret answered their knock, her expression surprised to see them so early and together. "Catherine, I did not expect you until this afternoon. And you brought—" She trailed off, looking at Edward uncertainly. "This is my husband, Edward," Catherine said simply. I have told him the truth about Elizabeth. He wishes to meet her. Margaret's face went pale. Catherine, I do not think— Please, Margaret, Catherine interrupted. I know this is sudden, but circumstances have changed. May we come in? Margaret stepped aside, clearly uncomfortable but unable to refuse. They entered a small but tidy sitting room. Everything was clean and well maintained, but the furniture was old and the decorations sparse. Edward could see Catherine's influence in small touches: a nice clock on the mantel, quality curtains on the windows, details that spoke of someone trying to add comfort within limited means. Elizabeth is in her room, studying, Margaret said quietly. Should I fetch her? Yes, please, Catherine said, then turned to Edward. Remember, go slowly. Let her adjust to your presence before expecting anything. Edward nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. What did one say to a secret stepdaughter one had just learned existed? They heard light footsteps on the stairs, and then Elizabeth appeared in the doorway. She was a lovely child with Catherine's dark hair and delicate features, but with hazel eyes that must have come from her father. She wore a simple dress that had been carefully mended in several places, and her hair was pulled back in a neat braid. Aunt Catherine! Elizabeth's face lit up with joy, then confusion, as she noticed Edward. Oh, I did not know you had company. Elizabeth, darling, come here, Catherine said gently. The girl approached, and Catherine put her arm around her shoulders. I want you to meet someone very important. This is my husband, Edward. Elizabeth's eyes went wide with shock and fear. She looked up at Catherine, then at Margaret, then back at Edward, clearly trying to understand what this meant. It is all right, Catherine assured her. He knows about you. I told him the truth. You told him. Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper. But you said he could never know, that it would ruin everything. Edward knelt down so he was at eye level with the girl. Elizabeth, I understand this is frightening and confusing. Your mother has been protecting you and me and many other people by keeping secrets. But I have learned the truth, and I wanted to meet you myself. Are you angry? Elizabeth asked, her voice trembling. At my mother? At me? The question pierced Edward's heart. This child feared she was the cause of problems, that her very existence was something to apologize for. I am not angry at you, Edward said firmly. You have done nothing wrong. As for your mother, we are working through complicated feelings together, but I am not here to cause trouble. I am here because you are important to the person I care about most, which makes you important to me. Elizabeth looked uncertain, seeking reassurance from Catherine. Is it really all right, Mother? Hearing Elizabeth call Catherine Mother, saying it openly in front of him, clearly meant something profound to the girl. Catherine nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes, my darling, it is all right. Things are changing, but hopefully changing for the better. Margaret brought tea, and they all sat in the small sitting room, an awkward but necessary gathering. Edward asked Elizabeth about her studies, her interests, her life. She answered shyly at first, but gradually relaxed as she realized he was genuinely interested in her responses. Elizabeth talked about her love of reading, particularly history and literature. She described her school and her teachers with animation. She mentioned friends cautiously, testing whether Edward would judge her for associating with working-class children. When he showed no disapproval, she became more open. Edward found himself genuinely charmed by the girl. She was intelligent and thoughtful, with a maturity beyond her years that probably came from understanding her complicated position in the world. She had Catherine's grace and quick wit, but also a guardedness that came from years of maintaining secrets. So your mother tells me you excel at your studies, Edward said. What would you like to do in the future? Elizabeth hesitated, glancing at Catherine. I should like to continue my education, perhaps become a teacher, but I know that may not be possible. Why not? Edward asked, though he knew the answer. Girls of Elizabeth's social position rarely had opportunities for advanced education or professional careers. Because I am— Elizabeth struggled for words. Because of who I am. What I am. You are a bright, capable young woman, Edward said firmly. Those qualities should determine your future, not circumstances of your birth that you had no control over. Elizabeth looked at him with surprise and tentative hope. Do you truly believe that? I do, Edward said, realizing as he spoke that he meant it. Whatever social conventions dictated, this child deserved opportunities based on her merit and potential, not her parentage. They talked for over an hour, with Catherine occasionally adding to the conversation, but mostly letting Edward and Elizabeth get to know each other. Margaret remained quiet but watchful, clearly protective of the girl she had raised. Finally, Edward stood to leave. "Elizabeth, I am glad I met you today. I hope this will not be the last time we speak." "Will you visit again?" Elizabeth asked, the hope in her voice both touching and heartbreaking. "If your mother and Aunt Margaret allow it, yes," Edward said, looking to Catherine for confirmation. Catherine nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering fear. "Yes, Edward will visit again." As they prepared to leave, Elizabeth suddenly stepped forward and took Edward's hand. "Thank you for not being angry," she said softly, "for not hating me, for existing." Edward felt his throat tighten. He squeezed her hand gently. "You have every right to exist, Elizabeth. I never doubt that." The carriage ride back to Mayfair was quiet at first. Catherine stared out the window, her handkerchief clutched in her hand, occasionally dabbing at her eyes. Edward sat beside her, processing everything he had witnessed. "She is remarkable," Edward said finally. "You should be very proud." "I am," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every day I am proud of her, and every day I am ashamed that I cannot give her the life she deserves." "Perhaps that can change," Edward said carefully. Catherine turned to look at him. "What are you suggesting?" "I am not certain yet," Edward admitted, "but we cannot continue as we have been. Today made that clear. Elizabeth deserves more than secret visits and a hidden existence, and you deserve more than living in constant fear." "But the scandal," Catherine protested. "Our children, your reputation, everything we discussed last night, none of that has changed." "No," Edward agreed. "But my perspective has changed. Meeting Elizabeth, seeing her reality rather than imagining it, that has made a difference. She is not an abstract problem to be managed. She is a real child with real needs and real potential." Catherine looked at him with an expression somewhere between hope and terror. "Edward, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "that there might be ways to improve Elizabeth's situation without necessarily causing the complete scandal we both fear, if we are thoughtful and careful about it." "Such as?" Catherine pressed. "We could acknowledge her as your ward," Edward suggested, "a distant relative that you are helping to educate and establish. It would not be the full truth, but it would allow her to have more connection to our family, more opportunities, without necessarily revealing everything." Catherine shook her head. "People would ask questions. They would want to know which relative, how we are connected, why this child has suddenly appeared. Our social circle would investigate, and eventually someone would discover inconsistencies." "Perhaps," Edward allowed. "But they would also see a duchess performing an act of charity toward a relative in need. That fits expectations of how our class should behave. Most people would accept the explanation because it makes sense within their worldview. And if they do not, if someone investigates more thoroughly and discovers the truth, then we will deal with that when it happens," Edward said. "But living in constant fear of discovery is its own kind of prison, Catherine. At some point, we must take risks to create a better situation." Catherine turned back to the window. "I need to think about this. It is too much, too fast." "I understand," Edward said. "But we also need to think about our other children. Robert and Margaret deserve to know the truth about their family. The longer we wait, the more betrayed they will feel when they eventually learn we kept this from them." Over the following days, Edward and Catherine discussed how to approach their children with the truth. Robert was home from Cambridge for a few weeks, and Margaret was still at the estate, making it possible to have a family conversation. The prospect filled Catherine with dread, but Edward insisted it was necessary. They called Robert and Margaret into the drawing room one evening after dinner. Both young people looked curious but unconcerned, assuming this was about some routine family matter. "Your mother and I need to tell you something important," Edward began, glancing at Catherine for support. "It concerns our family, and it will likely come as a shock to both of you." Margaret sat up straighter, her expression becoming anxious. "Is someone ill? Is something wrong?" "No one is ill," Catherine assured her quickly. "But there is something about my past, about our family, that you do not know. Something I should have told you long ago." Robert frowned. "Mother, what is this about?" Catherine took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. Edward reached over and took one of her hands, offering silent support. "Before I married your father, I was not the person you believe me to be. My background was not what I have told you." Over the next half hour, Catherine told her children the truth. She told them about her childhood in poverty, her position as a housemaid, her relationship with James Worthington, and the birth of Elizabeth. She told them about the deception that had brought her into society and led to her marriage with their father. And she told them about the double life she had been living for their entire lives, visiting and supporting a daughter they had never known existed. Robert and Margaret sat in stunned silence as the story unfolded. Margaret's face showed shock and confusion. Robert's expression was harder to read, cycling between disbelief, anger, and something that might have been hurt. When Catherine finished, the silence in the room was oppressive. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "You have been lying to us our entire lives, about who you are, where you came from, everything." "Yes," Catherine said simply, not attempting to excuse it. "I have. I thought I was protecting you, protecting our family, but I was also protecting myself from facing the consequences of my deception." "And father?" Margaret asked, looking at Edward. "Did you know?" "I only learned the truth recently," Edward said. "I had the same reaction you are having now, shock, anger, feeling betrayed. Those feelings are valid and understandable." "We have a sister," Margaret said slowly, as if testing the words. "A half-sister who has been living across the city all this time and we never knew. Her name is Elizabeth," Catherine said. "She is 12 years old. She is bright and kind and brave, and she has lived her entire life knowing she has siblings she could never meet, a family she could never be part of." Robert stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "How could you do this? Not just the lies, but keeping a child's secret, living a double life. What kind of person does that?" "A desperate one," Catherine said quietly. "A frightened one. Someone who saw an opportunity for security and took it, knowing the cost but unable to see another path." "That is not an excuse," Robert said harshly. "You built our entire family on lies. Do you have any idea how that makes me feel? Every memory I have of my childhood, of our family, now I have to question if any of it was real." "Your childhood was real," Edward interjected. "Your mother's love for you was real. The family we built together, whatever its foundation, created real bonds and real experiences. Do not let the revelation of this secret negate all the genuine moments you have shared." "How can you defend her?" Robert asked, turning his anger toward his father. "She deceived you most of all. She married you under false pretenses, lied about who she was, hid a child from you, and now you ask us to just accept it?" "I am not asking you to accept it immediately," Edward said calmly. "I am asking you to try to understand the circumstances that led to these choices. Your mother was 16 years old, alone, pregnant, with no resources and no support. She did what she felt she had to do to survive and protect her child. But 18 years of continued lying?" Margaret spoke up, her voice quieter than her brother's but no less pained. "Mother, you had chances to tell the truth. Once you were established, once we were older. Why continue the deception?" Catherine met her daughter's eyes. "Because I was a coward. Because every day it became harder to imagine revealing the truth. Because I convinced myself that maintaining the lie was kinder than exposing you all to scandal. But mainly, because I was afraid of losing everything I had built, including your love and respect." "And now we find out anyway," Robert said bitterly. "But at least now, you have had 18 years of living the life you wanted, while your other daughter lived in poverty." "Not poverty," Catherine said. "I have supported Elizabeth and Margaret financially. They have lived modestly, but comfortably." "How generous of you," Robert said sarcastically, "to provide your illegitimate daughter with modest comfort, while your legitimate children lived in luxury. That certainly seems equitable." The words stung, as they were meant to. Catherine flinched, but did not argue. Edward could see she felt she deserved Robert's anger, but he also saw how the young man's words were damaging any chance of moving forward constructively. "Robert, that is enough," Edward said firmly. "You have every right to your anger, but cruelty serves no purpose. We are telling you this truth now because we are trying to find a way forward as a family, all of us including Elizabeth. That will only be possible if we can move past blame and toward understanding." Robert stared at his father, then at his mother, his jaw working as he struggled with his emotions. Finally he spoke, his voice strained. "I need time. I cannot process this right now. I need to be alone." He left the room without waiting for a response. Margaret remained, tears streaming down her face. "I have a sister," she said again, as if the reality was only now truly settling in. "What is she like?" Catherine moved to sit beside her daughter, tentatively putting an arm around her shoulders. Margaret did not pull away. "She is like you in some ways. She loves to read, she is clever and asks thoughtful questions. But she has also lived with uncertainty and secrecy her entire life, which has made her cautious in ways you have never needed to be." "Can I meet her?" Margaret asked. The question surprised both Edward and Catherine. "You want to?" Catherine asked carefully. "She is my sister," Margaret said simply. "I do not understand everything about this situation yet. I am angry and confused and hurt. But she is my sister, and she has done nothing wrong. If you say she is good and kind, then I want to know her." Catherine pulled Margaret into a tight embrace, openly weeping now. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being willing to try." Over the following weeks, the family navigated their new reality with difficulty, but also with determination. Robert remained distant, processing his feelings privately. He spoke to his parents only when necessary and refused to discuss Elizabeth or any plans regarding her. Margaret, however, accompanied Catherine on her next visit to Clerkenwell. The meeting between the two sisters was awkward at first, both girls uncertain how to relate to each other, but gradually, as they discovered shared interests and similar temperaments, a tentative connection began to form. Edward continued to visit Elizabeth as well, bringing her books and engaging her in conversations about literature and history. He arranged for a better tutor to supplement her education, explaining it away as patronage of a promising student. He began to quietly investigate possibilities for her future, schools that might accept a girl of her background with proper sponsorship. The social challenge remained. They had not yet determined how or if to acknowledge Elizabeth more publicly. The risks were still substantial, but Edward had begun to realize that there were gradations of truth, ways to bring Elizabeth closer to the family circle without necessarily revealing everything immediately. He discussed with Catherine the possibility of introducing Elizabeth as a ward, a young relative they were sponsoring. It would raise questions, but as Edward had noted, it would also fit expected patterns of aristocratic charity. Many families took in distant relations or children of deceased friends. With careful management, Elizabeth could be gradually integrated into their world without immediate scandal. Catherine remained fearful, but also hopeful. For the first time in 18 years, she could see a path where her two families might somehow coexist, where she would not have to choose between her children or live in constant terror of discovery. The garden party at the Ashford country estate was in full swing, with guests from London and the surrounding counties mingling on the manicured lawns. Catherine moved through the crowd with her usual grace, but there was something different about her now. The perpetual tension that had characterized her bearing for so many years had eased. She smiled more freely, laughed more readily. Nearby, Margaret and Elizabeth stood together, Margaret introducing her younger sister to several young ladies of similar age. Elizabeth, now 14, had blossomed in the past 2 years. She attended a good school, dressed appropriately for her new station as the Duke of Ashford's ward, and carried herself with increasing confidence. The story they had told society was simple. Elizabeth was the daughter of a distant cousin who had fallen on hard times. The Duke and Duchess had taken responsibility for her education and establishment. It was not the complete truth, but it was enough truth to satisfy curiosity and allow Elizabeth a place in their world. Robert had eventually reconciled with the situation, though it had taken time. He had met Elizabeth several months after the initial revelation, maintaining polite but distant relations at first. But gradually he had begun to appreciate his half-sister's intelligence and resilience. Now he could be seen occasionally engaging her in conversation, treating her with the same mixture of fondness and exasperation he showed Margaret. The greatest surprise had come from an unexpected quarter. The Earl of Worthington, Elizabeth's uncle, had learned of her existence through society gossip about the Duke of Ashford's new ward. Rather than denying the connection, he had quietly investigated and confirmed the truth. To Edward and Catherine's shock, he had then approached them privately to acknowledge Elizabeth as his niece and offer additional support for her future. The Earl explained that his brother James had been wild and irresponsible, but the family had mourned his early death deeply. Learning that James had left a daughter, even under irregular circumstances, had been painful, but also brought an unexpected comfort. Elizabeth was a connection to the brother they had lost. The arrangement remained discreet. The Worthington family did not publicly claim Elizabeth, but they accepted her privately. The Earl's mother, Elizabeth's grandmother, had wept when she met the girl, seeing her lost son in her granddaughter's features. They provided additional financial support and social connections that would help establish Elizabeth's future. Edward stood with Thomas, his faithful coachman, watching the scene unfold. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out this way, Your Grace?" Thomas asked quietly. "No," Edward admitted. "When I borrowed your carriage 2 years ago, I thought I would discover a simple infidelity. Instead, I discovered how little I truly knew about my own wife, my own marriage, my own capacity for understanding. And you are satisfied with how things have resolved?" Edward considered the question carefully. Satisfied is perhaps too strong a word. We still live with elements of deception. The complete truth is known only to a few, but we have found a way forward that gives Elizabeth opportunities she would never have had, allows Catherine to acknowledge her daughter more openly, and keeps our family intact. Under the circumstances, I believe we have achieved the best outcome possible. Thomas nodded wisely. "Sometimes, Your Grace, the best outcome is not perfection, but simply better than it was before." Edward watched Catherine laugh at something Elizabeth said, saw Margaret link her arm through her half-sisters, observed Robert approaching the group to join their conversation. His family, complicated and imperfect, but genuine in ways it had never been before. "You are right, Thomas," Edward said, "and sometimes the journey to better begins with disguising yourself as someone else in order to finally see the truth." Thomas smiled. "Quite so, Your Grace. Quite so." As the afternoon sun cast golden light across the garden party, Edward reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here. The millionaire duke, who had disguised himself as a carriage driver to spy on his wife, had discovered far more than an affair. He had discovered the capacity for compassion over judgment, for adaptation over rigid adherence to rules, for love that transcended social expectations. The confession his wife had made during that fateful carriage ride had indeed changed everything, but not in the way he had feared. It had changed everything for the better, destroying a marriage built on lies and constructing in its place a family built on truth, however complicated that truth might be. And that, Edward had learned, was worth far more than a perfect reputation or an unblemished family name. It was worth everything. I hope you enjoyed this story. Today I have something new for you. If you enjoyed my narrations, I am sure you will also love my new prayer channel, Prayers with Alexander. Come with me to praise God with prayers full of faith every morning and every evening. The link is in the card above and also in the pinned comment. I am waiting for you there with all my heart. I would also love to know what you thought of this story. Tell me in the comments. And now another exciting video is appearing on your screen that will surely surprise you. Click to continue being moved by stories that touch the soul. I will see you there.